and welcome to Gifts of the Completed Life. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and today I'm excited to announce the launch of a new Gifts of the Completed Life series, Transitions and Transformations. Here I will explore what I like to call in-between spaces. We might experience these spaces within our families, with our health, and in our relationships. In-between spaces can be unsettling, challenging, and yet there are also gifts of the completed life that can be discovered in that space between where we were, where we are, and where we are going. Future episodes of this series will reflect upon transformation when we no longer find ourselves in between, and where we can discover gifts such as drying our wings and finishing strong. In our last session, Mark Barger Elliott, Executive Director of the Completed Life Initiative, offered an insight from Aristotle on how to think of a completed life. Referencing the work of Hilde Ving, a professor of philosophy in Norway, he explained how Aristotle was one of the first to bring forward this idea of a completed life. Aristotle observed that one way to view a completed life is in terms of time, meaning we can measure our lives by our lifetime. And when we die, our life is complete. But Ving points out how Aristotle also said we can have complete moments throughout our lives, that a complete life can have a sequence of moments of happiness or meaning, for example, that feel full and complete in and of themselves. These are the moments we will explore in this podcast, for they are the gifts of the completed life. Life is full of transitions, times and places in our lives when it feels as if we are standing in what I think of as between the tides, in that in-between place where the waters are advancing and receding around us. Some of these spaces are anticipated, like the summer between 3rd and 4th grade. But these in-between spaces, those between the tide places, can also be unsettling, like when we receive an unexpected medical diagnosis and wonder what will happen next. And yet it is here, I would like to suggest, that 3 gifts of the completed life can be discovered. The gift of life unsealed, the gift of predictable unpredictability, and the gift of creation in the cross currents. I would like to thank Adam Nicholson for his lovely book, Life Between the Tides, which helped me to identify these gifts. Nicholson, who writes about history and landscapes, turned his attention during the pandemic to the tides on the western coast of Scotland, where he found inspiration and renewal. Now, when I hear the word tides, my thoughts go immediately back to the beaches of Cape Cod, where I remember spending hours with my 3 children and my husband, Mark. Our favorite place to go at low tide was what the kids called the secret beach. On this beach, everything was magical, as our children gently lifted branches of seaweed brought in by the high tides and discovered secret kingdoms beneath those green limbs. Secret kingdoms where hermit crabs scampered about with their borrowed shells. Secret kingdoms where sacks of fish eggs clung to rocks as if they were superglued in place. There would be shells, the cracked ones we would throw back into the water, and others the kids would take home and put on their shelves next to their trophies. There would be minnows whose speed defied capture. There were Dr. Seuss-like bulbs that always held a mystique, as if they carried a story of a long journey from the depths of the ocean floors thousands of miles away. And then, of course, there was the granddaddy of them all, the blue crab, which burrowed its body in the sand, leaving only the tip of its claw visible to the human eye. I remember a time or two when one of our kids touched it without knowing and lifted their arm in horror to find a claw clamped to their finger. A fascinating idea that Nicholson offers regarding the tides is that in that place, life is unsealed. I took his insight to mean that in between the tides, the cover comes off. The seaweed is lifted, so to speak, and we discover the wondrous breadth of life that is happening around us if we stop and notice. In between the tides, when we are in between our coming and goings, we might feel life is standing still. Nothing is happening. But actually, it can be the opposite. It is there between the flux and stillness. As Nicholson puts it, life is being created and recreated all the time. These moments can be, in and of themselves, complete when we notice the power, the resilience of life. Now, tides have always intrigued me. How is it that a beach that was the size of a football field can all but disappear just a few hours later? And why are only oceans impacted, but not ponds or even the Great Lakes, which make up 20% of the world's fresh water? And why are there tide charts? How is it that the timing of the tides can be so erratic? Nicholson reminds the reader how scientists and observers of the tides have asked those same questions for thousands of years. Apollonius, a first-century philosopher from Cappadocia, speculated that the earth and sea were part of a living creature. As it inhaled and exhaled, it caused the ebb and flow of the tides. And there were others who imagined the tides were stirred up by a great whirlpool near Norway, which sucked in and then expelled water every 6 hours. And though centuries later, Kepler and Newton concluded that the tides were determined by gravity, mystery still hovered over this explanation, as the actual behavior of a tide varied ever so slightly in each local landscape. In the words of Nicholson, the long story of tides' motions has been framed around a dialogue of opposites. Are they governed by what is hidden, or by something that can be perceived in the material and mechanical world? In other words, can we know the tides? Or must we rely for our understanding in the end on something strange and unknowable? Well, what do we know about tides? How do they work? The short answer is the moon's gravity tugs at the waters of our oceans, not our inland lakes and rivers. They're too small to be impacted. And if I understand it correctly, the Earth and moon turn in the same direction, and the gravitational pull of the moon is strongest on whichever side of the Earth faces it. When gravity pulls the ocean towards the moon, a high tide occurs. That all seems predictable. So why, when you look at the tides chart, are the times so irregular? High tide in New York this morning was 8:49, and tonight it will be 9:23. That's a great question, and there's a fascinating explanation. We're accustomed to a 24-hour day, which is based on the time it takes for a specific site on Earth to rotate from an exact point under the sun back around to that same point again. That motion takes 24 hours. A lunar day, also known as a tidal day, is the time it takes for a specific site on the Earth to rotate from an exact point under the moon back to the same point. However, a lunar day is 50 minutes longer than a solar day. So it takes the Earth an extra 50 minutes to catch up to the moon. And this is why high tides occur 12 hours and 25 minutes apart. In other words, it takes 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes for the water at the shore to go from high to low, and then another 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes for the water at the shore to go from low to high, which explains why the tides seem to be so different every time you visit the beach. 50 minutes a day can add up. Reflecting on how tides work made me realize we live in a world that is predictably unpredictable. That twice every 24 hours and 50 minutes, a shoreline will be at high tide. And twice the tide will be at its lowest point. We live in a 24-hour world, in other words, and yet the tides come at us every 24 hours and 50 minutes. The tides, observes Nicholson, are thick with variability, and yet nothing is more predictable than the coming and going of the tide. Recognizing that truth that we live in a world that is predictably unpredictable is the second gift that we can discover when we find ourselves in between the tides. That looking down, we can see the predictable every 12 hours and 25 minutes, the tide rises. But the predictable is also framed by time, time that moves by another rhythm. This is also a complete moment when we come to see and to embrace both the predictable and the unpredictable parts of life. The third gift Nicholson points us toward is what we might call creation at the cross currents, meaning it's not only wonder we find when life is unsealed, when we lift the seaweed to discover what's underneath, and it's not just predictable unpredictability, but also something new is created in between the tides, and that is the third gift. For there, between the highest flow and the lowest ebb, tides bring together life forms that would never otherwise meet. Loose barnacles encounter branches from a kelp forest on the ocean floor, and the blue crab's claw brushes the egg sac of a skate. As Nicholson reminds us, Darwin was so captivated by these rich and diverse intersections of life, he spent 8 years in a tidal pool studying its adaptability and diversity. During the pandemic, Nicholson described moving to a western coast of Scotland with his family. In many ways, he was seeking new life in the midst of a turbulent time in our world. And Nicholson found it there. As he writes, in between the flux and the stillness, I found the core of being, the interplay, the give and take of the quick and the still, which led to animation of life. Often we can find ourselves in between where we were and where we are going, in between the tides, in between all that can change in our lives, in our jobs, our relationships, our health. And we wonder, what is there for me in that in-between place? I would like to suggest that it is there, in those in-between places, that we can find the gifts of the completed life, complete moments in delighting in life unsealed, recognizing the predictable unpredictability of life, and seeing there is creation, new life in the cross currents. Thank you for joining us for Gifts of the Completed Life, Transitions and Transformation. And thank you to Zoe Wilshire, the editor of Completed Life Podcasts. We invite you to join us next week as we consider the gift of night vision, completed moments between life and death. To listen to other episodes of Gifts of the Completed Life or our other podcast series, Voices of the Completed Life, you can find us on your favorite podcast platform or visit our website, completedlife.org, go to the Programs tab and scroll down. We would love to hear from you. Please send us your reflections, comments, and ideas of gifts or your stories of the completed life by emailing us at info@completedlife.org.